You know this verse, right? Of course you do. You've probably seen it pretty much everywhere on a t shirt, maybe a gym wall, or all over social media. And it feels like this incredible promise of unlimited power, almost like a spiritual blink check to go out and crush anything you set your mind to. But what if I told you that for centuries, a whole lot of us have been reading this verse and a bunch of others just like it completely wrong? What if the real meaning is actually something way deeper and maybe even more powerful? And that really brings us to the single most important skill for understanding texts like this: reading in context. So, our guiding principle today might sound a little bit radical. Never read a Bible verse. Well, at least not by itself. Look, the most common reason we misunderstand these things isn't because we're not smart enough or spiritual enough. Nope. It's simply the habit of pulling a single sentence out of its original home and treating it like a standalone fortune cookie saying. Yeah, there's actually a name for this. It's called proof texting. It's what happens when we treat the Bible less like a library of really carefully constructed stories and arguments, and more like, I don't know, a dictionary of inspirational quotes we can just grab to back up whatever we already think. There's a classic saying that just nails the danger here. A text without a context is a pretext for whatever you wanted to say. And a pretext is really just a fancy word for an excuse. When you rip a verse out of its context, you can make it mean almost anything, even something the original author would have totally disagreed with. Okay, so if the problem is reading verses all by themselves, the solution has got to be finding the author's complete thought. So how do we do that? Well, we learn how to spot the original unit of text that the verse actually belongs to. All right, there's a technical term for this, but trust me, it's a super practical idea. It's called a pericope. Just think of it as a complete thought unit, a whole argument or a story or a point. Our job as readers is to find that pericope before we try to figure out what the first means. And finding it isn't some big secret. It's actually pretty easy. First, just look for paragraph breaks in whatever translation you're using. They're usually a signal that a new idea is starting. You can also just look for topic shifts, places where the author clearly changes gears. The whole goal is to just keep reading until you can sit back and say, okay, yeah, I get the full point they're making here. Now, the best way to see how powerful this is to actually put it into practice. So let's take 3 of the most famous, most beloved, and most misunderstood verses out there and see what happens when we put them back where they belong. Let's go right back to where we started. When you read this verse alone, it is the ultimate motivational poster. But when you read the paragraph around it, wow, the meaning completely transforms from achieving anything to being content with anything. So get this, the author, Paul, is writing this from a prison cell, and he defines exactly what he means by all things. It's not about winning the big game or acing that final exam. It's about being content whether he has a ton of food or is starving, whether he's being celebrated or he's in chains. The strength he's talking about isn't for external achievement. It's for internal contentment. That's a huge difference. Okay, next up. This is a verse you will find on countless graduation cards. All by itself, it feels like a very personal promise from God for a great career, a happy life, the whole shebang. But the original context is so much bigger, and to be honest, it's a lot heavier. This was actually a letter, and it was written to an entire nation that had just been conquered and dragged off into exile. God is telling them to settle in, build houses, plant gardens, because they are going to be in Babylon for 70 years. So the promise isn't for immediate success for one person. It's a long-term promise that the entire nation will be restored. It's a light at the end of a very, very long tunnel. And finally, here's the verse a lot of people use to encourage small groups or meetings that don't have a huge turnout. We've all heard it, right? Well, where 2 or 3 are gathered, but the context isn't about the size of a worship service at all. It's actually about a very specific and very serious church function. If you look at the whole passage, you see it's all about the difficult process of church discipline, of confronting someone about their actions. The 2 or 3 who are gathered, well, they're the 2 or 3 witnesses required for that process. Jesus is promising his presence is there to validate the church's serious decisions. So, you see, the verse isn't about attendance, it's about authority. In every single one of these examples, you start to see a pattern, right? The out-of-context reading might feel simple and kind of uplifting on the surface, but the in-context reading is always richer, more substantial, and way more profound. Reading verses out of context gives us these shallow, generic slogans that can set us up with false expectations about life. But reading them in context gives us specific, deep truths that can build a truly resilient faith, one that can actually handle hardship and complexity. And this brings us to the most important takeaway of all. I think some people worry that looking at the context will somehow take away their favorite verses, but the exact opposite is true. Context doesn't limit the meaning, it reveals it. It's the key that unlocks what the author was trying to say all along. So, how do you actually apply this? Well, here's a simple challenge for you this week. First, before you try to interpret any verse, just commit to reading the whole paragraph it's in. Then ask yourself, what's the main point the author is trying to make here? And if you're up for it, pick a favorite verse of yours and read the entire chapter it comes from. Just see what you discover. You've just picked up a really powerful new tool for understanding. So the only question left is, where are you going to use it first? The library is open. Happy reading.